to chime in here. So hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Jill Morris. I'm the Executive Director of PALCI. And first, I wanted to let you know that today's event will be recorded. So we'll post and email links to the recording in Sched, and we'll send those along afterward as well, so you know where to find those recordings. And we're really thrilled to be able to do that. Back in June, we held our first virtual PALCI annual business meeting, which included a report from me and the board, a report from PALCI's Future Framing Task Force, and an announcement of PALCI's statement on racial injustices, as well as a presentation by our speaker, Noe Ortega, who's Deputy Secretary for the Office of Post-Secondary and Higher Education. He was actually recently promoted by Governor Wolf to serve as the Secretary of Education for Pennsylvania. Today, we're excited to kick off part 2 of that event with our PALCI member meeting summer event series. As you know, our member meeting was initially planned to take place in person in Pittsburgh this past June. We had to pivot away from meeting in person, and true to the theme of this meeting, we're learning to thrive in a time of disruption and rethink the way that we approach this event. So this is the first time we're hosting our member meeting events online. And we're just thrilled to see so many of you here today, knowing all of the other things you're juggling at this moment in time, and that so many more will benefit from being able to watch these recordings. So we're glad to still be able to reach many PALCI members and engage in this way. Before we get started, I just want to say another special thank you to the members of our PALCI member meeting planning committee, who put a great deal of thought into what would make for a relevant and exciting way to engage with each other during this really difficult time. Their ideas and their hard work are really what made today possible. So I want to say thank you to Sarah Barron, Paige Flanagan, Freya Gibbon, Ann Krakow, Amy McCall, Tim Schlack, and James Robinson. And I also want to offer a special shout out to our wonderful PALCI staff for their hard work every day in making PALCI events like these happen. They're really passionate about their work, as I know you all know, and passionate about this community, and it shows. So thank you to James, Allison, and Gretchen as well. I also want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors for today's event who made this gathering possible. Thanks to both ProQuest and EBSCO for their ongoing support of PALCI events. This is the 3rd or 4th year now in a row, I believe, and we're just really grateful to them for making this happen. Each sponsor has developed some opportunities to learn about what they're offering and the way they've been engaging with libraries over the past year. So you're going to find events that they're offering available in our Sched calendar. We would encourage you to check those out. If they're relevant to you, please do attend, and also please say thank you to them for their sponsorships of these meetings. I want to let you know quickly about PALCI's Code of Conduct. As stated in our PALCI Code of Conduct, PALCI values civility and therefore seeks to provide a mutually respectful, dignified, and harassment-free environment in which diverse participants may discuss, learn, network, and enjoy the company of colleagues. In order to maintain and strengthen such an environment, the PALCI Board of Directors has created and implemented this policy with a purpose of defining behaviors deemed unacceptable in all PALCI communications and gatherings, including but not limited to in-person, online, and asynchronous communications. The policy further seeks to explain the process behind resolving allegations of unacceptable behaviors by the participants. There exists a shared responsibility among all PALCI members to do their part through continued self-education as the basis of mutual respect for one another's rights and dignity. Each and every participant in the PALCI community and at all PALCI events must be aware that their actions affect others and that good and positive behavioral choices lead to more productive and successful events in collaboration. Therefore, this policy applies to all staff, members, participants, sponsors, vendors, volunteers, and any guest in attendance. Please take a chance to review our Code of Conduct at palci.org/conduct. And now I'm honored to introduce PALCI members to Bryan Alexander. Bryan Alexander is an internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, and teacher working in the field of how technology transforms education. I first heard Bryan speak as part of Ithaca SNR's The Next Wave conference, which occurs every year in New York City. I loved attending those meetings he facilitated because of his passion for the future of higher ed. Also his ability to help his audiences examine the future from all angles, and of course his appreciation for academic libraries as a part of that future. I was immediately excited about the idea of having Bryan join us here for this event, in large part because of the specific theme of this particular meeting. How can we thrive in a time of disruption? I'm very much looking forward to hearing his take on what's happening in higher ed as a result of the pandemic and other world events, and what he thinks this means for us as academic libraries. Bryan's currently a senior scholar at Georgetown University and teaches graduate seminars in their Learning, Design, and Technology program. Bryan's full bio is linked and available on the PALCI Sched site, and I would encourage everyone to go take a look at it, as well as links to his articles. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our PALCI summer speaker, Bryan Alexander.
Thank you so much, Jill. That's an incredibly kind introduction. If I didn't have so much hair in my face, you'd realize I was blushing. Let me thank you very, very much. And I'm absolutely delighted to work with all of you today. I would love to hear from you during this conversation as much as possible. You know, there's always the sign of a bad presenter when they say, this isn't a presentation so much as it is a conversation. And that usually means they didn't do any work, right? They didn't prepare anything. My problem's the opposite. I've prepared so much that I actually do need this to be a conversation. But I have a bunch of thoughts to share with you. And one of those thoughts is a very personal thought, that I come to you as not a professional librarian, but as a lifelong library fanboy. In fact, a couple of summers ago, some of you may have heard this story, I took my wife to see my childhood home on Long Island, where I grew up, and in the 1970s. And we did a big drive. We got down there, and the street had changed. And in fact, the house where I had grown up had been completely removed. The grounds had been completely erased, just scalped clean, and instead was a parched lot with a McMansion on it. And I was just horrified. I mean, it's one of those childhood shocks that, you know, your childhood space is gone. But down the block was the public library I'd always gone to when I was a little kid. In fact, I'd gone to it so often I became a kind of mascot. And when I left the area, my family moved away, some of the librarians came to my house and gave me a present of a few science fiction paperbacks because they missed me. So I took my wife to that library, and it had not changed. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, the architecture was the same. The floor plan was the same. I could walk through it. And I told this to a friend of mine, and he said, well, libraries prove that you can go home again. That is to say, I'm an incredibly sentimental library fan, and I'm happy to cheer on the cause wherever and whenever it is. Today, we're going to be talking about the enormous changes potentially rippling through higher education and how that changes the library world. And in order to do that, I'd like to start by discussing some of the big changes that were already pressing on all of us before COVID hit, before the year 2020. And I'd like to mention, these are three really, really large ones. In fact, there's a fourth that's actually pretty big. So let's begin by zooming out and thinking about this from a global perspective. And one of the things that's happened over the past roughly 20 years is that we've seen higher education become globalized. It's always been global in a sense. I mean, you look back at European or Indian or Chinese academic history, and you do have roving scholars. But what's happened is, using modern communication, travel technology, and based on globalization itself, we've had more and more interaction between nations. We've had more students moving between campuses, between nations than ever before. We've seen more interaction between productive research interaction between colleagues across universities, across time zones than ever before. That's been a really extraordinary development, and one that I don't think we've fully really recognized. But over the past few years, this has come into question, and it's really given us a divergent set of possibilities. I mean, on the one hand, we may be advancing towards a time when universities and colleges are inherently transnational. That is, that their student body is drawn from multiple countries, that their staff and their faculty are also drawn from multiple countries, and that they all interact more and more meaningfully and more frequently with peers, colleagues, and mentors all around the world. And you could think about this as a kind of global university with many, many instances around the world. Now, when you think about the role of libraries and you think about the expansion, say, of consortial lending, the expansion of shared collections, I mean, that's one of the dimensions that we can think about in the biggest possible picture. Now, the opposite of that is for the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen this global reaction against globalization. We've seen this in new forms of nationalism everywhere from Brexit in Britain to nationalist governments in the Philippines, Brazil, India, Turkey, the United States, Poland, and Hungary. And higher education plays a role in that. And that is, to the extent that higher education represents national agendas, it may be that we see a pressure to have higher education become more locally focused, more nationally focused. And we've seen a variety of prompts for that. We've seen a variety of inputs and ideas. Think about, for example, in Turkey with the push to teach more Islamic curriculum and more national curriculum. Or you see this in Poland and Hungary, the idea to try to resist Western developments in certain fields. And you can see this in language. In Italy and in Holland, there have been debates about whether or not the language of instruction should be English, simply because both nations say, no, if you're going to come to our country, you should study and learn the language. You should learn Dutch. You should learn Italian. We've seen some of this in South Africa as well. So it may be that we're watching a kind of countervailing motion, push towards more national organization, more national emphasis, more local emphasis. And that can appear in everything from research to teaching, which means for the library world, this can impact everything from collection development to also how you handle information literacy, digital literacy, even bibliographic instruction, which priorities you have to emphasize. So that's one enormous trend to look at. The second pre-COVID trend that I think, in theory, we're all aware of, but I don't think we've really fully grasped, is the continuing development of what some call the demographic transition. Is if some of you who are as old as I am or older throw your minds back to the 1960s and 70s, you'll recall that we had this fear of global overpopulation, that we would overproduce the number of humans that could live on Earth, that could be sustained. Well, it turns out that the opposite has actually occurred, that birth rates have fallen in nation after nation. And in fact, pretty much whenever a nation goes through modernity, modern development, two things happen. Women have fewer children later in life, and more people live longer. And this is a transformation that we really weren't prepared for. And we're just starting to wade into the first layer of it right now. Now, speaking of layers, let me give you a graphic demonstration. This is a glimpse of a demographic model of Germany and Germany's population. And you can see that what it does is it has layers by demographic age. So the very bottom layer is 8 kids, age 0 to 4, and then people 5 to 9, then 10 to 14, and so on. And you can see that what's happened is that this is a nation that's produced more teenagers than children, more middle-aged people than teenagers, and more seniors, more elders than middle-aged people. And we've seen this pattern reproduced in country after country around the world. There have been very, very few exceptions to it. And to be fair, higher education plays a role in making this happen. Higher education we know that the more education women get, the fewer children they have. And this is something which has enormous impact on where we're headed. Everything from K through 12 to traditionally gendered graduate education to how we teach elders. I mean, if the over 65 population grows and grows, how do we serve them? In academia, there's the question of, should we devote ourselves to more programs for seniors? This past year, we saw 2 really extremely different versions of this. In the upper Midwest, Minnesota had a program which allowed senior citizens to take for credit college classes, and the price was, I believe, $12 a credit hour. A news story broke on this as a human interest story, and it got a lot of attention because it was very exciting. And you saw footage of senior citizens saying, "This is great. I'm studying biology. I'm studying history, and I always wanted to. And it's really basically not costing me anything." Well, the blowback happened at scale, where you had millennials and Generation Z saying, "I would love to pay $12 an hour. Instead, I'm going to debt for the rest of my life. This is terrible." So there was a lot of back and forth. Meanwhile, in Arizona State University, they broke ground on a residence hall that's entirely for retirees. It's basically a condo in Arizona, so it's pretty expensive. But if you got into it, you would have not only your condo space, but you would have access to all the Arizona State University activities. You could go to classes, you could be a docent in museums, you could see movies and performances and all kinds of things. So it's a very different model, targeting seniors, targeting wealthy seniors, but again, for reasons that are very appropriate. You have people who want to stay active, they want to stay in touch, maybe they want to keep their brains developing to ward off any kind of cognitive decline issues. These are the kind of thoughts that this graph brings to mind. How are we going to change and rethink higher education? And when this comes to public libraries and academic libraries, this gives us all kinds of interesting service questions. Which collections do we develop? How do we shape services and conversations? I'll give you a couple of examples. In Toronto, a think tank was tasked with trying to suss out how they could redesign the city of Toronto as they have more and more people with cognitive issues inhabiting the life of the city. So you have elders who do not have full-time care, for example, or who are not in memory facilities. And the question is, how do you make a city more livable for them? And they had some fascinating choices. I mean, one was to expand the medians in roads. Because when you cross a street, that's a major cognitive task. Well, if you widen a median enough, you have to cross it twice rather than once. It reduces the cognitive load. But the one that comes to mind here for you all is the idea of reducing the number of touchscreens, because people over 65 tend not to grow up with touchscreen technology. It's a cognitive burden. It's an extra load to go through. Instead, they went back towards buttons and knobs. We have to think about this, what kind of ways that we can respond. There's an international dimension to this as well. I mentioned that every nation that goes through modernity has gone through this process, but not every nation has fully gone through that. If you look at this map, the nations that are the dark blue are the ones that are still producing children at scale. And you can see that they are mostly in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as a few in Central Asia, and a little bit in Southeast Asia. So again, if we're thinking about ourselves as actors on the global stage, this may be where we turn when we want to recruit traditional age undergraduate students. It may be where we partner with local K through 12 as well as local undergraduate institutions. And that provides a very different take on how we've internationalized higher education. I mean, if you look to the map, you can see that two of the nations that we've really drawn on recently, China and India, are just not the producers of kids. Now, let me give you one more academic trend, and then I'll give you the biggest one of all. Now, the academic trend is one that I think we're all familiar with, but the data on it is important, and its confirmation, I think, is especially important. And basically speaking, we are witnessing a shift in student preference for courses of study. Generally speaking, students are preferring more and more classes in STEM, in particular the life sciences, as well as economics and business, and they're moving away from the humanities. So if you look at this chart, and this is fantastic research done by the American Historical Association. If you look at the top right, if you look at degrees that are just racing ahead in numbers, the ones that are increasing, these are increasing by more than 50% in a 6-year period. We're looking at exercise science, computer science, nursing, health and medical, computer science, engineering. You see a theme there. And if you look at the very bottom left, if you look at the ones that are losing degrees by 20% or more. They're seeing philosophy, English, foreign languages, humanities in general, religion and history. I mean, it's a pretty stark move. And this is not much of a surprise. I come from my own PhDs in English, so I know this all too well. I suspect that the COVID pandemic is not going to change this. In fact, quite the opposite. It's going to accelerate people going into the health sciences as well as the sciences in general. And this has implications for curriculum. And so if you look across the nation, whenever you see talk of reducing curriculum, closing departments, merging departments, generally speaking, it's the ones on the bottom left that are on the chopping block. And if you see the departments that are getting more infusions of support from foundations, from state governments, from donors, they tend to be on the upper right of this. And when it comes to libraries, of course, this has implications for collections. This has implications for different sub-libraries for universities that are at scale, you know, your architecture library, your engineering library. And this has implications for how we support instructors in instruction, you know, which classes get called on the most. And this then has implications for hiring and specialization. Now, the biggest driver of change, the most significant push on higher education is the one that's the biggest push on the world as large. Climate change is pretty hard to ignore, although we try mightily to ignore it. This image is one that I just can't get enough of. It's a satellite map showing you the Northwest Passage is now open. If that statement doesn't give you a chill or a thrill, remember that people sought the Northwest Passage for hundreds of years. That is a passageway between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans in northern Canada. And many, many people died along the way. There are epic stories about this because it was basically locked solid by ice. Well, the Anthropocene has pushed this open so that now you can move from across these two oceans fairly easily. This is something that we really, in fact, I have a friend who's done this trip a couple of times. Now, why this matters? Well, it depends on how we respond within higher education. For example, think about our campuses, our physical campuses, our bricks and mortar campuses. How do we change our buildings? I mean, do we make our buildings more carbon neutral? Do we ramp up the ways of making them more environmentally sound? Do we try to restructure and build new buildings that require less in the way of air conditioning? Where do we get their power from? Do we rely on the grid? Or do we source local power? Do we put up more solar? Do we put up more wind, depending on where you are? If you're lucky enough to have water, do you have low-head hydro, for example? How do we change our transportation? Does our campus shuttle become electric? Do we, in fact, ban carbon-burning vehicles from campus? What happens to campus food? I mean, do we have a return to the local growing of 2008? Does food services start pushing a less carbon-intensive diet, i.e., cafeterias offer more in the way of vegan diet? What happens to campus IT departments? Do they become more green, or do they become used more and more often? Do we, for example, worry that IT requires a carbon draw because it's so power intensive? So do we move away from power intensive technologies such as blockchain or VR? Or do we just simply use IT more and more to replace travel? In the chat box, Lisa McDaniel says that, oh, sorry, Lisa, I misread your question. I'm gonna come back to it in a minute. We also have the overall campus question of, do we relocate entire campuses that are in danger? When you think, for example, those in Philadelphia, in New York, in Boston, all along the Atlantic seacoast. Think about the ones on the west coast of the United States, the Pacific. If you look at Europe, you look at Central Asia, you look at East Asia, time and again, we have campuses that are in the danger zone. Just recently, the Miami-Dade County in Florida hired the U.S. Corps of Engineers to give them an estimate on flood mitigation. I counted about 35 different campuses in their flood mitigation zone. How many of these campuses relocate to drier land? They relocate to, say, central or western New York or Pennsylvania, for example. How about campuses that are in danger of desertification? University of Nevada, Las Vegas, for example. When do we decide that those are just too expensive and too dangerous to maintain? Do we simply close them, or do we relocate them? Our research changes as well. You think about how our fields expand. Obviously, earth science, environmental studies have to grow. Which fields will dwindle as a response? Which ones will be seen as not as useful? Will we see uprisings against petroleum engineering as a program, for example? Will we see the emergence of new domains and new disciplines? Will there be political challenges to these? And you think about our teaching, how it changes. When we have new curricula that arise, or new pedagogies in response to student movements. Let me just back up on that. Every step of the way, this impacts how we do libraries. So, for example, we think about the physical library building. Does the library building have to be armored, structured, elevated? For example, New Orleans has pioneered the use of a kind of a shutter that can be attached to windows that blocks out water. What happens to the digital library? Does the digital library become criticized as being a carbon sink or a carbon draw? Or do we support digital libraries as a way of reducing the number of physical materials being shipped around? And when you think about research, what happens to the fields that you get to support? Again, do we see environmental studies? Do we see climate change become the leading curricular node on campus? And how do we get to support that in libraries? And then as new disciplines and new domains appear, how do we catalog them? How do we fit them into a changed curriculum? And when we have political pressure, how does that impact public libraries as well as academic libraries? For example, if you're in a town that is very anti-climate change, that is, it thinks climate change is a scam and so on, do you get local politicians, local figures, families, media start poking at libraries for holding books that they see as dangerous? Or do you get the reverse? Do you get a town, county, or state that is very, very pro-green, the very, very Green New Deal, very Greta Thunberg oriented? And do they then go after libraries for not being sufficiently green? All these tensions can play a role. And the same, of course, occurs with trying to support teaching. Now, this all gives us one of the great challenges that we haven't really talked about in higher ed, that's just beginning to start, I think, which is the role of higher education on the global stage of climate change. Do we get academics serving as public intellectuals? Does academia help lead mitigation efforts? Do you work with local efforts? So if you're in Philadelphia, for example, or if you're in New York City, how do public libraries react when the local city or county or state starts building up seawalls? How do you interact with a state government or a town government that wants you to reduce the amount of air conditioning, and so on? I mean, there's a public role here for libraries, both academic and public, that we need to pay attention to. And of course, this impacts the internationalization I mentioned before. One way of thinking about climate change is that it's a global systematic threat, and that's one that requires a global systematic response. However, we have no governance structure for this in place at all right now, and there's very little in the way of global political consensus around this. So, does higher education follow one of these paths? Do we become more disintegrated, disaggregated, and separate, or do we become more synthetic and more international? So those are large, large topics. But before we go into that, I want to come back to the questions that have been bubbling up in the chat, because they're terrific questions. And I will try not to massacre names as much as I can. Stephen B says that most of this, he's referring to the enrollment changes, is how things are going. But even STEM and health students do need to take gen ed courses in liberal arts, so these departments continue to have some high enrollment, if not majors. It's quite true, Stephen. I often think about classical studies as a model, where we have relatively very, very few classical studies majors out there, but classical studies programs play an active gen ed role. They teach classes not just in Latin and Greek, but also ancient history and mythology, interdisciplinary classes on the hero and on the epic. So it may be that this is what happens to philosophy, to history, to English, that these become gen ed predominantly programs. That's a big shift. that's a huge transformation in emphasis. And that can lead to a financial cut as well. And again, you think about how many graduate students are prepared in Research One universities to primarily be researchers. To be teachers in a gen ed program requires quite a different amount of preparation. David is referring to one of the scenarios and says that although the humanities have demand for via gen ed requirements, they're subordinate to requirements of STEM and health programs. Yeah. For example, think about English, where you might get more demand for writing and less demand for literature. And the literature that's in demand may be skewed towards health and sciences. So you get more classes in literature of science, for example, or history of science, or history of technology, and again, philosophy, ethics of healthcare, and so on. So, that can really, really reshape the curriculum. Lisa McDaniels mentions that many of these general education courses could be outsourced. This is a topic of great discussion right now, and we're going to circle back to that. But that's definitely something that is possible, especially for cost mitigation purposes. Teresa mentions that beyond gen ed, there are courses integrated into STEM health requirements, especially for ethics courses focused on relevant issues. Absolutely. Think about business ethics classes. Roaz, I believe, asks, do you have a sense of what the age 65 plus want to study and the difference between those trends and the ones that iPads, I assume the iPads data show? Right now, the over 65 seems to be pretty diverse in terms of what they want to study. So it may be that that becomes a way to support the humanities. So the humanities pivot towards teaching elders. That's one possibility. Some of the iPads data is very interesting. I think iPads tends to underestimate adult learners, but also I'm looking ahead towards the next 5-10 years as to where these could go. And I really, really think we will see more and more seniors spending more and more time invested in higher education. Good questions, everybody. We just covered a whole range of ground about some of the big trends that are reshaping higher education. Let's push on a bit into the year 2020, and let's look at what just happened. Let's take a breath for a second and look back. I mean, it's always tricky to try to analyze history when you're in the middle of it, but we can get a bit of a sense of it. And to begin with, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, the worst we've seen in a century. It's truly, truly extraordinary, although not unprecedented. We are tracking it, monitoring it. It's changing our lives in all kinds of ways. And we'll be talking about this. I have to confess, I've gotten some notoriety for one page in my latest book. Academia Next came out from Johns Hopkins University Press this winter. And in the first major chapter, I was asking people to imagine changes to higher education. I wanted to get them thinking about this. And so one prompt I gave is the now notorious page 23, where I said, well, let's imagine a future academy after a major pandemic has struck the world, say along the lines of the Great Influenza. I asked people to think about changes in curriculum, changes in pedagogy, changes in athletics, going online, and so on. And ever since people have rediscovered this page since February, I've gotten all kinds of hilarious questions. Alexander, what did you know? What kind of dark forces do you conspire with? But this is actually in the futures world. This is standard practice. We've been thinking about and planning the impact of epidemics for 40 years. It's just part of what we do. But I'm sorry that this one came true. I wish my crystal ball would reveal things that are more cheerful and less lethal. So how do we experience this? Well, in academia and in the glam fields, we experience this, most people, as a black swan. That this came out of nowhere. The term black swan, I strongly recommend reading Nicholas Taleb's book on the subject, where he coins the term. A black swan is a statistically unlikely event, something that just is not on anybody's radar. The odds of it happening are really, really low. But when it does happen, it has a huge impact on things. And afterwards, we tend to assume that it's all we planned for this ahead of time. So in our lifetimes, we can think of a few black swans. September 11th is one of the biggest. The 2008 financial crash, if you look through the summer and spring of 2008, you see over and over again the consensus statement that the economy is doing great, the financial sector is healthy. If you'd like, I strongly recommend the documentary film Inside Job, if you haven't seen it. It's by far the best documentary about the 2008 financial crash. Matthew Damon has completely got the wrong career as an actor. He should be a voice actor. He's really good at it. But one of the things that I recommend this movie for is because it focuses on academics' role in it and how many academics pushed the idea that the economy was actually quite healthy. And that's how we experienced the COVID-19's onslaught as something completely out of nowhere. And it's obviously changing things. We've also experienced this immediately in our bodies in the form of injuries and deaths. The death tolls that I've been seeing right now, I believe we're at 165,000 in the United States. The injuries aren't as easy to track, partly because we're still trying to trace connections between the virus and injuries, but for years to come, we're going to be experiencing people with COVID lung, with heart problems from COVID, with respiratory problems. And we've already experienced deaths and injuries on our campuses. And we've also experienced enormous anxiety and conflict about this. Just the psychological pressure of this is just off the charts for a lot of people in a lot of recent American history. Just experiencing so much dread, living with death and injury is taking an enormous toll on us. And the conflict is obviously spilled out in all kinds of ways. Now, in the springtime, we did something in the United States, which is literally unprecedented. We got online. We took all of our education, whipped it online fast. And that is still something I don't think is truly appreciated, just how radical a step that was. In a matter of weeks, if not days, we shifted higher education, generally speaking, from face-to-face to online. We did this with incredible deployment, and we did this with a lot of learning along the way, just rapidly figuring stuff out, what Zoom is, how to use the LMS asynchronously, all this good stuff. We had to learn in a hurry. And we didn't do it perfectly. Maybe a lot of people didn't do it well, but it happened in a hurry. We learned a lot along the way. That was exhausting. I mean, nobody got time off to do this. Nobody had downtime for this. People spent vacations doing this. People worked weekends and nights. Instructional technologists played a heroic role in all of this. And librarians did a key role in helping make all of this happen. Everything from helping point us to digital resources to the librarians who work with online classes. The globalization of higher education I've been talking about just paused. I mean, the shipping of students across national borders slowed down and then just really slowed down. People didn't want students from Italy for a while, or from China, and now from India, Brazil, or the United States. So all of that is really just slackened. And some countries are hit harder than others. Australia is being clobbered. They get roughly a third of their students from China. So if you look at Australia right now, they are doing furloughs, layoffs, budget cuts all over the map. And the US is being hit hard by this. We've been drawing more and more international students, and the lack of them is a real problem. The Trump administration's multiple decisions about restricting international students has made this even worse. So let me just pause for a second. I mean, that's just a quick snapshot of what happened in the spring. I want to make sure that we get questions. Milton Galvez says, we live in history, but we don't realize it until it's over. That's always a great problem. Always a great problem. It's kind of asymptotic realization. Therese asks, do you think COVID-19 financial appeals qualify as black swans, or are we just bad at paying attention and preparing in advance? I think, I mean, as a futurist, I spend a lot of my time trying to draw attention to potential threats. And I think a lot of people basically haven't listened. Therese, if you look at the countries that are responding effectively to COVID, you'll see that a group of them recently went through a similar threat with SARS and some with MERS. And so they are in many ways prepared. You think Canada, for example, which had a terrible scare with SARS, they pivoted very, very fast to deal with COVID-19. You look at other East Asian nations that did the same thing. I think a lot of people just aren't really good at paying attention. And the problem is, although our brains are wired for novelty, we also tend to prefer the ordinary and the mundane, and the extraordinary, the truly unlikely. It's hard to focus on. I mean, you mentioned Katrina, for example. Yes, I lived and worked in Louisiana in the 1990s and the early 21st century. And it was expected that at some point, New Orleans and southern Louisiana would get knocked flat by a giant hurricane. And one of the interesting dynamics that happened then was that time and again, you had city officials in New Orleans, and you had parish officials and state officials who, remember, Louisiana is not a rich state by any means. Again and again, they made the statistical decision that they would not vote for more resources for flood mitigation and damage control because that was unlikely to happen during their term, as a city councilor or as a governor or a representative to the state house. I mean, it's always a challenge. Taleb has a second book called Anti-Fragile, where he recommends people to think in terms of resiliency in some creative ways. And that's a lot harder to do. It's absolutely a good question, a really good question. David Runyon recommends the ostrich paradox, which I don't know, so thank you. Now, let's look at where we are. Let's fast forward from spring into summer. And let's think about what we're trying to do now. Well, we're trying to plan for a fall. And this is very, very difficult. And before I get there, let me just mention two other facets about the summer. One is in the library world, that lots of public libraries and academic libraries have been trying to figure out different forms of service. I mean, some of you here are doing curbside pickup and delivery. Quite a few of you are experiencing or trying to support expanded online access to everything from databases to ebooks, struggling with publishers like Macmillan who really don't want you to loan very many digital books. Just here's a quick shout out to my local libraries, my Georgetown University Library and my local county libraries who are working their brains out trying to expand service. They're doing great work. I just really admire them. And it's difficult to do this. It's very challenging to rethink the whole materials provision process. So we're doing this now. The second thing is, and we'll come back to this again, that in the summer, we've also experienced this massive national mobilization against anti-Black racism sparked by the murder of George Floyd. We call this a Black Lives Matter 2.0 movement, but the fact is we are now, as a nation, magnetized by the problem of racism, and we are trying to figure out ways to respond. And this is rippling up and down society, everything from policing to selection of vice presidential candidates, as we just saw yesterday, to curriculum, to pedagogy. And this is going to unfurl in different ways, from the naming of campus buildings, to what books we collect, to what faces are represented on our staffs. I mean, library staff, like a lot of academic staff, have traditionally not been as diverse as the populations we serve or the populations in a society we inhabit. So all of those pressures and opportunities are on us right now. So under those pressures, we are planning out the fall. I published a few scenarios. This is a screenshot from a Wall Street Journal interview with me, where I put out 3 possible ways for campuses to operate in the fall. One is the idea of what I call a post-COVID campus. And this is one where a college or university opens up for face-to-face instruction. The idea being that they think they are safe enough, that they're on their campus past the pandemic, that it is not going to be a major factor for them. Or, like some presidents have said, it'll be a factor like other healthcare issues, like AIDS or like the flu. It's one that is known, and they have public health measures for treating. That'll be the model for that. The second model is what I call COVID fall, and that's an entirely online fall semester. And that's because the pandemic is still a major threat. And the third scenario I call the toggle term. And that is where the campuses switch back and forth between those previous two scenarios, depending on where things are. So for example, think about a campus that opens up for face-to-face instruction in September, and they have most of their students there with social distancing, with PPE, with plexiglass and so on. But then in October, a big wave of infections comes about, and it may be in the region. So for example, imagine central Pennsylvania getting suddenly whelmed by a big wave of infections from the rural middle of the state. Or think about an infection that comes about through a super spreader. A faculty member goes to campus and they've been interacting with a church or a fraternity or a foreign group, and they infect people and the infection spreads. The campus then throws the switch, flips the toggle, and they go wholly online. Then comes January and the infection has been tamped down and they throw the switch the other way. So those are the three scenarios that I posited. And I've so far seen that we are planning on each of those. Up until recently, the majority of campuses, as far as our data show, were planning for the post-COVID campus. That has switched over the past couple of weeks, and now the majority seem to be preparing for either a COVID fall or a blended mix with some proportion of students online, some proportion face-to-face. The toggle term almost nobody wants to talk about, but you can see hints about it. For example, some liberal arts colleges have welcomed students back to campus, but warned them they have to pack light just in case. And we can see signs of this planning in all kinds of data. And again, I'm coming back to Milton's point that it's hard to keep up with this because this is happening all around us right now. But polling of senior staff, that is presidents, provosts, and deans of colleges and universities, showed that a lot of them are prepared to hunker down, but that cuts are definitely on the table, including layoffs and cutting research and development. We know that IT departments are basically planning for everything at once, that they're planning for a lot of online learning, which may be blended or just online, as well as for supporting face-to-face classrooms. One of the great developments of our time, and this is, I think, I hate to say silver lining, but I can say just a positive development in the crisis, is that we are starting to recognize that people have been thinking, researching, practicing, teaching, and thinking again about how to teach online for quite some time. We now have a body of literature that people can refer to and use. It kind of reminds me of podcasting. When podcasting first began in 2004, 2005, I was entertained to see people who discovered it saying, "Oh, this is great. We can tell stories with audio." And you see all these old radio people and say, yeah, we know about that. It's kind of like this now where you've got faculty who are saying in April, in May, "Oh my gosh, how do I teach online? How do I win student attention? What's the right length of a video? What is asynchronous?" And all these instructional designers saying, "I'm glad you asked. Here's a stack of books. Here's a zillion articles." I mean, we have a whole profession based on this. So, it's great to have that in-house expertise that we can draw on. And I think that's a very positive step. And we're also, as I mentioned before, trying to rethink racial equity. And so again, just to reiterate, this comes up in terms of curriculum design. This is showing up in terms of representation that applies to hiring as well as promotion, tenure, and review. This is showing up in terms of how we support incoming students. I mean, this is just clearly a major part of our planning. Now, a lot depends on which way the pandemic goes. So, for example, do we get a kind of single wave, a single burst? I mean, if you look at the data for the US, and you'll see that we had a huge uptick in March and April, and then we are now experiencing a second uptick. It may be that we then enjoy a fall after that. And in autumn, we see the number of cases fall. And we go through what, say, China went through in Hubei province, where they basically had this kind of pure curve. Some cases afterwards, but largely under control. We could experience that. And to an extent, New York is experiencing that. New York, which went through the worst of it, the most hellish experience in the American pandemic story so far. And yet now you have deans at Columbia University urging faculty and graduate students to come back and teach in person. That's one possible curve, and we respond to that in certain ways. Another is that COVID simply continues. It just roars on. And there are a lot of reasons for this. It may be that we don't have a vaccine in time, and we don't. And in fact, no one's ever built a vaccine for coronavirus. This is a brand new idea, and this could take some time. Now, if we get a vaccine, say we get one in January, we still have the enormous problem of production and distribution. And not to mention the problems of anti-vaxxers, anti-vax attitudes. So that could take some time, months, if not years, to unfold. So we may be living with this for quite some time. Or we get it in waves, where the waves just come and go, like the toggle term scenario I mentioned before. And again, there are a lot of things that can trigger this. Foreign travel is one. Mutations. It's possible that we will get a especially virulent form of COVID-19. But again, these shape how we respond. These shape how we act and how we perceive them. We had a question from Stephen B. I wanted to take in. And again, friends, I'm really appreciative of your questions, or these are terrific. Stephen B. asks, given the renewed interest in instructional design services and support, do you think academic libraries should add an instructional designer position to their staff, and even do so if they have to trade off a librarian position in order to do so? Might this enable us to become more responsive to faculty needs in the post-COVID landscape? And that's a great question. I can definitely see this as an option for both public and academic libraries to have some kind of extra staff capacity in this. Now, do you do this by hiring more people? And is it possible to get support for that? Can you get more financial support from an institution for this? That's one way forward. The other is, as you say, to trade a librarian position. Say, instead of replacing a librarian who retires, switch out their position for an ID position. That's definitely up there. There's also a third possibility, which is cross-training, just building an in-house capacity for instructional design. Maybe working with your own campus ID staff, as well as academic computing and instructional technologists. So definitely, these are all possible. You may have some cross hires where people are hired into both, say, IT in the library or a learning center in the library. So it may be that academic libraries really have an angle for this. I would reach out to library schools and information schools and ask about their production of graduates and how many of them have some form of ID skills and backgrounds. How many of them teach instructional design? And to what degree? Should you make a special library degree or information degree that has an ID emphasis? Great question, Steve. Great question. So we're making these choices in the face of other external forces that are pretty stark. So one of them is that we are likely to experience a significant drop in public funding for everything related to education and culture. This can happen at the state level, and this is already happening at the state level. This can happen at the county level and the city level. And simply put, the reason is one side effect that we haven't mentioned of COVID-19 is an incredibly stark recession. Right now, the data is that the second quarter of 2020 experienced an unbelievable cut in GDP. We saw humongous hits to unemployment, or to employment rather. And the US Census had a newsletter where they said that 41% of Americans claimed that someone in their family has lost a job or income as a result of this recession. Well, all of this means human suffering. It also means that governments have less revenue because we're spending less. They get less in the way of taxes. At the same time, these governments often have to spend more for the healthcare crisis. They may have to spend more, if they're a state government, on Medicare and Medicaid. They may have to spend more on providing PPE and other measures for their staff. They might do more on deep cleaning for facilities, and they also have to do more to provide just general public health education. Well, given this, I mean, it's likely, it's almost a certainty, that we'll see across the board cuts to public higher education. And we know this because for the past 40 years, American states, red and blue, north, south, east, and west, have cut per state funding across the board. In fact, there's a bracing story from the state of Michigan where the prior governor took office facing a budget crunch, went from city to city, town to town, asking every conceivable audience what should be cut, what should be in the chopping block. And she put up a PowerPoint presentation, gave people clickers and said, all right, what should we cut? You know, should we cut roads? Should we cut public transportation? How about public health care? How about all this? And every single time, every audience, the number one cut, public higher education. And this is, I mean, this is not a deep red state. If you're curious about this pattern, I recommend Chris Newfield's great work. Most recently, his book from Johns Hopkins called The Great Mistake, where he documents this extensively. And we've already seen evidence of this. Nevada, Colorado, state after state is issuing cuts, and among other casualties are public higher education. So we know this is going to trickle down into campus budgets and hit you all very, very firmly. And we know the same for public libraries, where you are also facing cuts from the public side. At the same time, we know that privately, you know, about 1/3 of higher education in the US is private, roughly. We know that they're facing challenges as well, because families, remember that 41% I mentioned from the US Census, if families can't afford to spend a lot on higher education, they may kind of downshift their expectations. They may, instead of sending an 18-year-old to research one university, send them to a more affordable state school, instead of a state school to a community college. You know, picking out a private undergraduate curriculum based on both its financial aid package, as they always do, but also its curriculum. You know, which of these is most likely to get a job? And again, you remember that enrollment chart from before, which of these is most likely to have STEM and public healthcare, and healthcare in different ways. So we may just see this kind of a decrease in the amount of money that families are willing to spend. And obviously this impacts everything in the library world. I mean, thinking about millages to support, or any kind of local taxes to support library funds, but also where it comes to library support for open education resources. I mean, do you get, is this a great time now for a great push towards OER? Because so many families will want to save money any way they can. And a $500 textbook may just be a bridge too far. The same may be true of supporting open access and scholarly publication, because, you know, we have, with a pandemic, there's such demand for cutting edge research on this epidemic problem. And a lot of publishers, Wiley, Elsevier, Nature, have been putting out open versions of stuff. It's not all there. Is this going to be a time to pressure academics to really move towards OA? In the chat, we have a question from Teresa, who asks, how disruptive do you think alternative educational routes will be to traditional college university degrees, certification through Coursera and so forth? So far, they haven't been disruptive. But it's possible that we will see more and more of this among people on the right side of the digital divide. So, you know, instead of leaving home to go to a campus that may be dangerous with infections, stay home instead. And while you're there, why don't you consider something like Coursera or FutureLearn from the UK? We may see that. The reason I qualify that is because the traditional brands still retain an enormous draw. We know that in online learning, people often choose online providers that are geographically nearby, even though there's no reason to, in terms of the technology. And we know that you know, the U.S. News World ranking and hierarchy is still there, and still very, very followed. So, I mean, I'm cautious based on branding. We have the question about Minerva. If you don't know this, the Minerva Project is a very interesting one. It's an online kind of hybrid project to do an elite liberal arts college experience with a lot of multiple sites and integration across the world. And it's very interesting, Lisa. It has all kinds of benefits. The reason I'm cautious about it is partly I'm still talking with the people there, and I'd like to learn more and host some of them on my program. But also because the scale is so small. It's an expensive program. It's covering a small population, and there haven't been imitations of it so far. The expense is one part that worries me. We also have, this is from Eric Norberg, who says, seeing as you have the dark eye and can see the future, what will the next disaster be? You mentioned climate change, but The Economist also had a cover looking at all these other major threats. Well, one of my favorite jobs that I dream about is Nick Bostrom's job at Oxford. He runs their Center for Existential Threats to the Human Race. And this is all he studies. He studies asteroids, he studies pandemics, he studies climate change, he studies the threats of AI. And right now, they're pretty excited about the dangers of AI to society in different ways. I think in many ways we can overblow that. There's a lot of hype involved, but that is pretty interesting. The climate change threats, I think, in some ways are the worst. Depending on the model you look at, some of these are the most terrifying because they're hardest to stop and hardest to avoid. And if you look at our response to COVID, we seem to be pretty poor at grappling with them. The volcanic dust ones, though, really do scare me. If you want, there's a movie with a goofy title called Supervolcano, which is actually pretty good, which gives you an example of that. I'd also, if we're looking at the threats, I'd also consider tailored viruses and bacteriological warfare. Other questions have come up. Lisa McDaniel says that she doesn't think Minerva has a library. I might be wrong on this, Lisa. I agree, they don't have a library, but I think they have collaborative relationships with different institutional libraries. Let's see if I'm right. I'm not sure if I'm right about that. David Runyon mentions outsourcing general education courses. Do you see potential and value in outsourcing or centralizing library services? I'd be surprised if that doesn't come up on every single campus in the United States. I heard a college president once tell me that his ideal library would be an interlibrary loan office and nothing else. There's going to be a huge amount of pressure to outsource just about everything. Oberlin College, for example, a liberal arts college in Ohio that has a great reputation for concern for social justice. They just broke their local union, laid off a bunch of staff who are majority non-white, working at very low wages, and outsourced them all to Aramark. And this wasn't done from sadism. It was done because Oberlin is facing a huge budget threat, and they're very concerned about this. And their library director then also left, which is interesting timing. I could talk about that another time. Well, my point is that outsourcing is in the air, I would not be surprised to see more of this. I would also look at more interest in pooled collections, especially off-site collections. I wouldn't be surprised if campuses are more interested in close analyses about non-circulating materials. Definitely anything that campuses can do to cut costs, they will want to be thinking about right now. You mentioned centralizing library services. David, I'm going to come back to that because this echoes another theme, but I think a lot of state university systems are very, very interested in that. I'll come back to that. Stephen B. suggests the comparison to economy airlines. Here's what you get for base tuition. So you're talking about kind of unbundling, like what we're doing now with streaming services. Here's what you get for base tuition. Do you want all online or face-to-face? Do you want to add housing, recreation, library access? We may see that being offered. Campuses like cable companies really don't want to do this, but we could see that kind of a la carte model. I don't think it's dystopian. I think it may be a serious risk to the financials. Boaz asks, if the international trend continues, the internationalization trend, and pandemic, et cetera, keep going, Do we see an emergence of new collections or services focused specifically on periods of life and geographies under particular time-bound and emergent risks? Absolutely. I mean, more and more content just for that. I mean, it's kind of, the demand should be great for that. Can we sustain in libraries the quick response attitude? That's a good question. Well, that's a really good question. Higher education is facing the quick response attitude right now, which is leading to some very interesting political and structural challenges. For example, how do you handle governance? You know, does the structuring of PPE provisions, does the amount of plexiglass purchased, does this have to go through a faculty committee or a full vote of the faculty? How do you handle that loop of information decision making? We're having a hard time with this in higher education. Libraries are smaller, of course, but you know, having an eye on that kind of emergency information is very, very difficult. I would say that libraries have one great advantage, which is that of anybody in the GLAM world, in the academic world, libraries collaborate like nobody's business. You guys are the collaboration gurus. You are always ahead of everybody else in collaboration. So you know, I showed my kids the you know, Ghostbusters movie, and you know, naturally, if you remember the movie in the beginning, there's a possessed card catalog, and my kids were like, "Dad, isn't this what you told us about card catalogs in the past?" Yes, 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 yes. And now we have online catalogs. You are good children. Yes. Teresa responds that ILL depends on having actual libraries to get the materials from. Absolutely. I didn't say that I agreed with the president's idea. And it may be that that's all he wanted for his school. And then he'd be a very bad partner in that ILL network. And it may be that you know, the president would be talked into having a ILL office, and behind it, a kind of non-circulating to the general public collection. But that kind of demand is there. And Lisa's right. We need publishers that allow for shareable ebooks, and for publishers to stop suing the Internet Archive. This is definitely something that really needs to be held. Cornelia Tencheva says, Brian's responding to many questions that do not appear in the chat window. It was just the one so far, Cornelia, but I'll read them all. Yes, every question that comes in via text, I'm reading out loud so that everyone can hear and see it. Andrew asks, what will create the tipping point for copyright laws to evolve in a way that makes sense for academic and shared digital resources? I think I've been following copyright very closely for some time. It helps that my background, my PhD was in the 18th century. And of course, that's when we get the Statute of Anne and the US Constitution, so that's all there. We passed really quietly one signal moment that really took my breath away, which is that Disney did not lobby for copyright extension, and Disney is letting some stuff go into the public domain. I wonder. I mean, Disney is ferocious when it comes to copyright. I do wonder. Right now, there's very little political consensus for it. We have a very partisan politics, and copyright doesn't really show up that way. You can get weird alliances between Republicans and Democrats and copyright. I lived in Vermont for 20 years, and I used to get into just epic arguments with the Pat Leahy office about this, because Leahy was always a big pusher for every strong copyright measure you could think of. I think this is something that higher education has to lobby for as a whole, and that's very difficult for us to do. It may be that this is a generational challenge, that we need a generation of rising politicians in their 20s and 30s who have a completely different life experience of copyright to push forward. I hope that library groups, ACRL, ALA can push for this as well. It may be that some of the print publishers and some of the big IP holders like Elsevier pivot away in their strategy from focusing so much on content defense towards data. And this is the Elsevier model right now. They don't think of themselves as a content company, which is a data company. But we really, really need to push on that, Andrew. Thank you for raising that. Notice we still have the DMCA, a hodgepodge of a shambles of a law. It's been amended in some good ways, but it takes time. I think the Librarian of Congress also can play a role in Janelle, collaboration is why ILL works. I agree. I'm a huge ILL fanatic. When I was teaching in Louisiana, I was single-handedly responsible for 40% of ILL traffic one year. I asked the head of Oxford University Press, North America, once in a public setting what she thought of ILL, and she said, "Oh, it's pure evil." So, good questions. Good questions. Keep them coming. I've got some more slides. Got to hit a few more points. So, we're talking about finance. There's other financial angles that we have to think about. I and others like this guy here, this is Steve Galloway from NYU, we've been arguing that we should experience a net enrollment drop this fall and maybe this spring. And there's a little backstory behind that. In the United States, enrollment in higher education started growing around 1983. It grew before that, but the most recent spurt. And it went from 1983-ish to 2012. And it's remarkable. I mean, someone mentioned before, we don't recognize history when we're living in it. This is historically huge. This is a growth spurt on par with the GI Bill growth in the 50s and the 60s, on par with the huge boom in land-grant universities after the Civil War. I mean, there's no name for it. Clay Shirky called the golden age. I mean, it's not bad. It's enormous, enormous growth. And that's fantastic. You know, that's an enormous amount of education. That's just terrific. And we should all be very proud of that. But about 2012, the total number of students enrolled in American higher education started going down and has gone down every semester since. Depending on which number you use, we're about 8 or 10% down from that 2012 peak. Now, this decline has appeared unevenly. I mean, Harvard hasn't suffered. The biggest cut has been in for-profit colleges and universities, which suffered tremendously under the second Obama administration. They hemorrhaged students, often for good reasons, because they were doing a lousy job. Community colleges enjoyed an uptick from 2008, and they have been losing numbers ever since. But also, one thing to think about is that if students exited those two sectors of higher education, they haven't gone to the other ones. I mean, people aren't leaving ITT and going to Penn State. You know, they're not leaving Bucks County Community College in numbers and instead going to Cornell. They're leaving higher education. So the enrollment drop has been happening. And it happens unevenly geographically. I can speak to it if you want. But the idea here is that it may be that COVID sparks further enrollment decline. And the reasons are kind of obvious. I mean, I mentioned the financial problems. If families that just they can't afford to do it, or they see themselves as being unable to afford it. But also, it may be that people are afraid of the experience. Either they fear that the physical experience will be too risky, and we've already seen story after story about K through 12 infections that proceed like wildfire, but also in higher ed. We've had cases of fraternities in Seattle, for example, where the infections just took off like mad. And this is in summer enrollment. We also may have fears of online education just not being very good. And it may be that that negative reputation will persist. Karen Diaz points out that in the past, economic declines have sent people back to college. Absolutely, Karen. I mean, in 2008, that's where we had that last surge from 2008 to 2012 during that terrible economy. And that's what, we had community colleges actually adding trailers and classes in tents to hold the overflow. So far, we're not seeing a net sense of that so far because of the fears. I mean, because the reason here is different. I mean, you think about the job question. Do I go to work as a waiter? Do I go to work, as a firefighter, knowing that I am at risk of an infection? And that's a decision that's being made across the country by people, especially people who are poor and people who don't have health care. It's a different question to ask about education. Do I go back to take classes as a firefighter? Do I go back to take classes in culinary arts? And then there's also the fear that some of these just aren't going to be as good for some of these programs. So do I get a degree in culinary arts where I cannot, physically cook with my instructor? Do I get a degree in engines and diesel technology when I can't put my hands on an engine as often? So it may be that it's a wash, but it may be that it's a decline. So that's another factor to consider. Galloway points out two possibilities, and I'm not sure about these, but I'd like to share them because they're possibilities. He argues that the elite institutions, so he teaches at NYU, for example, so schools like that, may be able to expand the number of students they teach because they will have no real cost at doing so because they're teaching online. So instead of having 2,000, why not have 5,000? Instead of 3,000, why not 20,000? I'm not seeing any evidence of this so far, but it's possible that they could do this for the next academic year or start in spring. The argument, it's an old economic argument that there's no bricks and mortar cost to bring in more students. You can just scale them up. But that's one possibility. The second that I think is more likely is that we should see more corporate partnerships between colleges and universities and companies. In Galloway's vision, he's thinking that Apple would partner with Columbia, for example, or that Microsoft would partner with MIT. But partner, I don't mean donate a building. I mean partner in a huge company, like almost merger way. I know that I've heard from presidents, provosts, chancellors across the country that they are eager for such partnerships because of the financial pressures they're facing right now. Not seeing many of these really take off. Teresa, I understand. It's great to hear from you. Please reach out to me. I'd be glad to talk with you. Aaron, you asked if we already were there. If you want to just, which there are you talking about? Let me know. Sharon Wiles Young, I believe. So how about mergers of colleges and universities and partnerships? See, that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind. That's one of the real possibilities. Because if you look at, say, for example, a state system, North Carolina, California State University, SUNY and CUNY, the two Penn State systems, PALCI and Penn State, these are areas where some of us have been talking about mergers for a while. I think Rand Corporation did a study 2 years ago where they were calling on a big merger in the PALCI system in Pennsylvania. These had all kinds of reasons for it, and a lot of states have been pushing for this. The politics of it are hard. In Vermont, there was a big push to try to link 3 public universities, which blew up. Chancellor resigned in the face of that. In Connecticut, there was a pre-COVID push to unify a lot of the community colleges in that state. That got balked, but they're trying it again right now. Alaska is doing this in different ways. Alaska is a weird situation because the campuses are physically so remote from each other. But there's a lot of push for this, and this can happen on any number of levels. You could think, for example, about just not teaching a subject at one campus, but instead teaching at this other one. You could think about combining back-end operations. Some already do this, but some don't, in terms of, say, learning management systems, or in terms of HR, or in terms of even ERP. There's a lot of back-end stuff that can be done. And then sharing academics, having a professor teach a class face-to-face at one campus while also teaching it online for students elsewhere in the system. There are a lot of possibilities for this, but the politics are really tricky. Ahmad mentions questioning the value proposition of higher ed, and that is going on right now. What is the value of college sports? I mean, we've seen 2 of the big conferences, Pac-12 and the Big Ten, just decided they're not going to have a fall semester play. They're going to push off to the spring. But how valuable is that? How much did that matter? How about fraternities? How about residence life? I mean, all these value propositions we're thinking about. There's one more question. I didn't want to lose anybody. I thought we had a question here. Oh, yes. Ahmad mentions being part of NYU and seeing mergers of the school and the School of Engineering. It is a tedious and long process. Indeed it is, Ahmad. If you want another example, you can think about UMass Boston, which purchased Wheelock College over the past 2 years. And UMass Boston is now doing budget cuts, and the first ones are landing at the Wheelock part of their synthesis. So yes, it can be very difficult. Boaz adds, data-driven quick response emerging ecosystems require librarians' organizational and metadata skills, as well as information governance. Do we see any evidence on increased hiring of librarians to support such efforts? I haven't, but I haven't been looking very hard for that particular hiring pattern, Boaz. If anybody else has, please let us know. Obviously, there's a lot more interest in librarians working on data. But in terms of this, that's a good call. I think for a lot of universities and colleges, they want to do that centrally. Okay, good questions. You guys are terrific. Moving on a bit, we have some cuts that are already happening. We're in a new fiscal year. In the last fiscal year, in May and June, I monitored a whole series of cuts. Those usually took the forms of furloughs, hiring freezes, reductions in some funding, professional development, for example, travel, of course. Now we're in a new fiscal year, and we're seeing the cuts really strike more deeply into flesh and bone. This is just a sample, the screenshot here of a few colleges and universities I was tracking. You can see cutting jobs and staff, reassigning people, ending faculty, including tenured faculty. University of North Carolina asked each campus chancellor to prepare plans, cutting their budgets by between 25 and 50%. And this is just the beginning. This is just the start. This could get much, much worse. And we should expect a couple of ways for this to proceed. One is for there to be administrative decisions to cut programs. So you may see the administration laying down the law and saying these departments will have this many fewer faculty, these units will have this many fewer staff. You may also see campus governance decisions with faculty participation. The term of art here is academic program prioritization. And on its good side, that's a process that involves open data and open conversation and participation. On its bad side, it's like a cross between Hunger Games and Lord of the Flies. But the key thing is for faculty to bash out which units they're going to cut. There's a third possibility, which is declaring financial exigency. No one's doing this yet, really. A couple did, and they actually closed on the West Coast. But we may see more of that depending on how fall enrollment goes. Now, at different colleges and universities, we could find examples of different ways they've implemented these policies. For example, Purdue University and Brown University were two of the leaders in having face-to-face education. Purdue's president told the U.S. Congress that he had personally ordered a mile of plexiglass. So they're doing this. And they actually did a crowdsourced or crowdfunding project to raise funds to pay for PPE for students, faculty, and staff. You have other campuses that have just gone wholly online. The California State University system just did that right out of the box in June. They're one of the first. We're seeing more and more do this, although they have different ways of calling it remote instruction, for example. And there's some interesting, cases of the toggle term. This is one I've got from Community College Dean Matt Reed, who points out that he had a little language saying that courses can be held remotely until we get to the all clear, which time they'll move to the campus. So then you can see little hints of the toggle term. And you also see processes. And some of you in New York are experiencing this right now because New York State is doing this, where you start from quarantine or lockdown, and then you gradually undo that and return piece by piece, step by step to face-to-face experience. So this is from Houston Community College, for example. You can see phase 1, temporary building access, phase 2, access to certain buildings for certain curricula, phase 3, more labs, phase 4, blended, and so on. So we've seen that. We've also seen campuses just mess with the timeline. And it doesn't sound that big a deal, but it's a really interesting strategy. So for example, Beloit College came up with this. As far as I could tell, they're the first ones to do this. They cut their semester down from 15 weeks to 7. And the 7-week semester is an intensive one. So instead of taking 4 classes, you would take 2. And the idea here is pretty interesting. It makes it easier to do the toggle. So you're not cutting out in the middle of the semester. It gives you a decision point that's shorter, easier to reach for. It also means, this is a little controversial, but I think it makes sense. If students feel they're going to lose a chunk of their academic career to COVID, if it's a smaller unit, it won't bother them as much. So if it's only 7 weeks instead of a full semester, it won't bother them as much. So we've seen that. We've also seen virtual gap programs because students are talking about gap years in all kinds of ways. In fact, Harvard's incoming first-year class, it looks like 20% of them are deferring enrollment for a year, 20%, which is a large number. And so presumably they're doing something else. They're going on a gap year, which can be working on a project, they're traveling, although how they do that is a good question. So campuses are trying to grapple with that. So this is Champlain College, for example, which has just offered its own virtual gap program. Other colleges and universities are trying to do that as well, so they can still have that revenue, but also a connection with the students. They can contribute meaningfully to the students' career path. In fact, my friends and colleagues, Josh Kim and Eddie Maloney at Dartmouth and Georgetown, produced 15 possible fall scenarios, which are just to show you just how diverse the different options are. I recommend reading their work to get a sense of it. They actually have a new book coming out pretty soon. But that includes having graduate students online, whereas undergrads are face-to-face. Having the high-flex model. High-flex means that students and faculty have the choice of participating in a class online like we are now or face-to-face, which is interesting. And I can talk about that as much as you like. But I want to dive into the question of how we actually teach right now. So I want to shift that focus because a lot of you are involved in supporting that process to different degrees, but also thinking through how teaching changes, I think will point to some ways that that libraries in general will change through their services. So to begin with, we have this choice. Are we entirely online, or are we face-to-face, or is there some blend? For example, a couple of colleges are talking about having only their first-year students come to campus this fall. Sophomores, juniors, seniors, online. But then in the spring, the first-year students go back home and stay on and go online, and the seniors come to campus, for example. So there's different ways of blending this. Well, doing this online is something we know how to do. I mentioned before, we have all this practice in teaching online. And librarians have been online since the beginning. Librarians have been early adopters of technology. I mean, in the 80s, not only did you shift from print card catalogs to online catalogs, but you also built MARC standard. You built WorldCat. I mean, you guys, are pioneers of moving academic services online. That's one of the reasons librarians are awesome. And we know that teaching, we know how to do this. So this is a screenshot from my spring class. I was actually teaching a class on education and technology this spring. It was kind of like the best prepared class for that experience. And we know how to do this. We know all kinds of aspects of it. It gives us challenges that we know how to meet, but they take time and they take support. They take learning. So how do you build a learning community online? That takes certain strategies. How do you reproduce residence life online? I mean, do you have WhatsApp groups for college classes, for example? Do you try to reproduce fraternity life or dorm life through a WhatsApp group or through a YouTube video? And then what happens to class size? And this is interesting. I mean, do you cut classes down in size because that increases the attention, or do you increase them because you have no physical limit on the number of students who can be in them? Now, there's a question of steady improvement culture. That is, you're constantly looking at what works and what doesn't work. I mean, in theory, face-to-face bricks and mortar education has done this as well. But the idea being that online makes it a little even easier. You try and monitor just how many minutes can a video be, just what proportion of the class should be online, and what part, or should be synchronous, what part should be asynchronous. We have the ability to draw on professionals and research. And we have more and more library materials online and more librarian outreach online. So this is a chance for librarians to be embedded in the learning management system more than they already have been, more chances for faculty to link to digital resources, be they OER or database research, database resources that are accessed through the catalog. This is a great opportunity for that library facilitated transition online. The biggest obstacle that we've got right now is the problem of hands-on work. You think about sculpture, you think about dance, you think about dissection, you think about working on a diesel engine. So what do we do about that if we're online? Well, one option is to teach around it. Teach all the subjects that are not that, and to defer it for a little while. Another is to assign a local instance. So, for example, mentioning culinary arts. If your students don't have access to a kitchen, if they can arrange for a kitchen in a local community center or some other, participating restaurant to help out with that. Digital simulations are also available, and they're being used in different ways, but they're uneven in quality, and they're not available for everything. The other is just to put off that chunk of the curriculum. So you have your pre-med students who just aren't going to be doing dissections this semester. The culinary arts program just takes a hiatus for a semester or a year or more. Now, face-to-face, we have all kinds of, just one other point. A lot of these require finding resources online. Again, that's one of the classic roles for libraries. Now, face-to-face is something which gives us more opportunities and more challenges. I mean, it's kind of the ideal for a lot of people in their mind. It's the cliche of higher education. It's the nostalgia version, but it's going to have problems because even if a campus like Purdue or Brown opens face-to-face, there are going to be students who choose to stay away. They'll be afraid of infection, either for themselves or for affecting their families. They have to implement extensive safety measures, and those just ramify. I saw from Georgia Tech this sad photo of an instructor standing in front of a plexiglass shield. The plexiglass shield came up to his eyes because he himself was 6'3", and the shield was too short. Right? So, to get proper plexiglass shields for all kinds of buildings across the campus, not just classes, but also other offices. You have to pay for PPE. You have to enforce social distancing. This is one reason why University of Texas Austin was having classes outside, and some classes in Southern California were having classes outside because the weather allows it for now, and they need the space. What happens as well when you have older faculty and older staff, especially those with comorbidities? And again, the comorbidity list is a little variable depending on what you get, but you think about people with COPD, people who have diabetes, people with heart or lung challenges. Do they want people who are immunocompromised? Can they be asked back to campus? I mean, this is a process of politics and micropolitics that's really, really tricky. What happens to the public? What happens to the academic library? If you reopen and you have fewer and fewer students, or you are compelled to allow fewer and fewer students into the library just in order to maintain social distancing? Do you separate out by times so that only certain classes can come in certain times of the day? Do you separate out by profession? So 9 to 11 is when faculty can come in. 11 to 5 is when students can come in. 5 to 6 is when staff can come in, and so on. And then we have town gown issues, which are just horrendous right now. And no one's really diving into this, but think about it this way. If you have a face-to-face campus open this fall, does the campus have to analyze the local community for how it complies with COVID-19 countermeasures? Do you endorse a restaurant because they do a good job with social distancing? Do you ask that they avoid a certain tattoo parlor because they don't? Moreover, is the town going to face threats of infection from your students? I've already seen Middlebury, Vermont, where there was a petition taken up by locals to urge that college, Middlebury College, to not have students on campus because they were afraid of infection. Median age in Vermont is about 45, so there's a healthy amount of elders who are in the danger zone there. So the face-to-face issues just ramify further and further. And then, of course, there's the problem of winter. On the one hand, if you're in Southern California or Texas, yeah, you can teach outside. If you're in Pennsylvania, New York, or Maine, you're not so likely to teach outside in November, much less January. There's also the possibility of a second wave of infections, and we talked about a multi-wave attack, and it's possible that we'll see that happen as well, either just because of mutation or a spread of infection, or because people get other seasonal diseases that weaken them for this, such as the flu. I mean, above all is this challenge of how do you do face-to-face interaction? I mean, how do you do the reference conversation? How do you do a makerspace? When being there, having that high bandwidth exchange, when you can see a person's eyes, when you can hear the inflections in their voice, when you can watch their body language, you can hear the timing of their words and get a sense of what they're struggling with, where they're headed. It's so much harder to do that if you're face-to-face, but 6 feet plus away, wearing a mask, behind a visor, much less doing it online. Now, the HyFlex method I mentioned before, this has been very popular. People have been talking about this in a lot of ways. I've seen quite a few campuses say they're not doing it and they're doing something else, and the something else is HyFlex under a different name. So that's there. And if you want to do HyFlex well, you have to have a lot of things in place. You need to have sufficient hardware, both on site and with every person who's remote. Same thing for software, same thing for networks, which runs at the digital divide. You need to change your pedagogy if you're the instructor, because the instructor has to keep in mind this kind of two-phase, two-level class, in person and remote. And students have to change their behavior. They have to always be mindful of the students in the other world. Now, if you're curious about it, here's an ebook from Brian Beatty, who coined the term. And here's a link to a video program I did with him and with hundreds of people talking about where HyFlex could go. I've taught in HyFlex. Here's a shot of one of my classes with me there in the bottom. And you can see on the screen a couple of the students who are remote and face-to-face. You can see a bunch of other ones. I'll be glad to talk about that if you like. I think it's very effective, actually. We've got other challenges that come up, and let me just run through these. And I want to hear some more questions from you all about this. We have to balance synchronous versus asynchronous learning. So, synchronous learning, like we're doing now, our synchronous meeting has the benefits of being live and exciting and echoing that face-to-face experience. It lets us pop in questions as we go. It gives us a deeper sense of other people. It has a disadvantage, many disadvantages, one being that because of the digital divide, not everyone can do this. And the digital divide doesn't have to necessarily be structural, it can be temporary. Last week I was interviewing somebody on video, and one of our participants had to phone in without video because she lost power. These things happen, right? There's also problems of Zoom fatigue. A 3-hour class in video can really be draining. I'm trying to keep this 2-hour session as lively and painless as possible, but it really can take some time. Then how do we also deal with people who may have different issues? For example, people with different learning disabilities for whom synchronous video can be disturbing. Or if you're asked to show your home environment, people who have little kids running around or animals, or their home is a mess or they're embarrassed by it. So we have all kinds of challenges with that. Then how do you make synchronous work? So that balance is tricky. The LMS environment is really interesting because the learning management system is usually one that is not very open. That is, you can't trace a link back inside an LMS. LMSs tend to try and keep content inside. Do we shift them around to make them more open? Or do we push more stuff into the LMS behind firewalls because we're afraid of trolling online and abuse online? That may just heighten over the next 3 months of the election. A couple of questions about teaching. I'm going to come back to that. Let me just finish this couple of points because they may feed into it. Our curriculum might change as a result of the pandemic. It seems likely that we'll see more and more people taking more classes and the full spectrum of allied healthcare. Everything from radiology, gerontology, hospital administration, psychology. I wouldn't be surprised to see business and poli-sci also enjoy some growth as our economy and our politics face challenges. And I wouldn't, knowing the humanists like myself, I wouldn't be surprised to see more and more classes, single one-off classes pitched towards this, like having a history of pandemics, disease and literature. I actually did a blog post where we had a syllabus for this. I'd be glad to share if you like. But the flip side is which classes don't enjoy increases, which classes get cut. Do we see a kind of post-COVID curriculum, which looks a little differently? And we've seen classes about COVID, a whole bunch of them, often multidisciplinary, which is very exciting. A couple of liberal arts colleges did this. Whitman College, you can see here just from one screenshot, they had people from sociology, environmental studies, people from language, people from film, people from German Hispanic studies that all did a role in this class together. We have other questions that change how we use other things that pre-exist COVID. How do we handle data? We've had a lot of controversy about data gathering, data analytics over the past couple of years, partly with anxiety over companies like Facebook and Google, and also concern about surveillance either from companies or governments or from each other. But we've also had the push to do more data analytics in education to help outcomes and to help students. Well, that controversy becomes interesting when we have to gather more data about students because of COVID. That is, on the one hand, we have to worry about gathering data because we have to do contact tracing. We have to do more analysis of students, if they get infected, where they went and that kind of thing. Right now, you have a lot of mobile apps that will give you a daily prompt to check your health and report that back. There's some mobile apps that will track your physical whereabouts on campus. Again, all for the necessity of trying to build up a public health picture. All of these are privacy problems. How do we fall about this? On the other hand, if we're worried about enrollment, if we're worried about our finances, we have a greater incentive to do more learning analytics so that we can better help students process through our classes so they can have a more successful experience. How we handle this is going to be very, very tricky. Does open become something that we embrace now? Does open become, is 2020 the year of the open flip? Do we get a majority of students using resources that are open as a result of this? Do we get more open access and more shared teaching? What happens as well to some of the bleeding edge technologies, such as, for example, VR, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, or extended reality? I mean, on the one hand, this can be a way to get a deeper immersion with other people to build a better sense of community and personal presence. Or do we see the opposite? Do we see people avoiding these because they don't work well across the digital divide? Overall, how do we struggle to try to make the online experience as good as the face-to-face one? How do we make it better? And this is something which I know libraries have long wrestled with. How do you deal with ebooks that may or may not be as good? How do you deal with online service to make that even more effective? I want to wrap up with some advice and some thoughts and some cheer, but let me just walk back to some of your excellent questions. Karen and Stephen asked about how you did HighFlex. Well, a few things. In terms of hardware, I had to make sure that the remote students had good laptops with good cameras and audio. And the audio was actually pretty easy to do. The cameras took some doing, not supplying them, but using them. I had to make sure the students could be seen. The hardware was more challenging in the face-to-face class because we had to get really good mics. And that's challenging if you've ever worked with audio because we had a big classroom, so we had to deal with echo problems. But we also had, how do you pick up multiple voices at once? So one solution was actually everybody to log into Zoom and work on their laptops face-to-face. Another was to use different hardware. So we had ceiling-mounted mics for a while. We had, then we used the OWL microphone camera setup, which I do recommend. It's very, very good. Then we also had to make sure bandwidth was sufficient, and that wasn't always the case. We had some students who couldn't get sufficient bandwidth for video, and they were audio only. In terms of software, we standardized on Zoom, like a lot of people, but I've seen this as well, of course, with other tools like Adobe Connect and Microsoft Teams and so forth. We relied on the LMS, which I'm ambivalent about. I tend to be someone who uses the rest of the web, and I did take them to using other tools like Hypothesis. Pedagogically, it was interesting. I tend to get meta, and also this is a program on learning design technology, so it's appropriate to get meta. So I asked the students for help in shaping this. And it was really interesting to see what their desire was. Some of them really wanted to cut down the live video. They just felt too drained by it. Some of them, for their jobs, were spending so much time on live video, they were just burned out by it. So we figured out other ways of having live interaction that didn't involve video. I use Google Jamboard, for example, to do all kinds of brainstorming together with post-it notes. I also broke up class sessions into video and non-video moments. So they'd have, okay, take 10 minutes to do X and Y, and then turn your camera off and then rejoin us, that kind of thing. I also really emphasized the asynchronous work, and that was mostly through discussion posts, but it really, really worked out in this class. Again, I think one of the biggest changes really was the live experience of trying to make sure that everybody felt included. So for me, it felt kind of like putting on glasses for the first time. I had to put the glasses on and see one group of students online, and then take them off and see the other students face to face. Over time, this became really easy. This became second nature. But I also had to call on them. I had to make a point of finding the students who seemed to be least engaged or the ones who were suffering the most. And one of the ways I did this for the remote students was to always have chat open with them. I would often direct chat with them, private chat, to say how they're going and to recommend something. And then the students, I kept breaking them into groups that mixed in-person and online classes. So those are a few of the things that we did. David R. asks, how do we keep being fully human in the highly personal process of education? Does this require adaptations for now, or largely permanent shifts in how humans interact? What a fantastic question. I think the answer is yes. I think we're doing some temporary transitions that are becoming, some of which are becoming permanent. So we are learning how to do live video well. We're learning which tools react well. And so we may be using Slack more than ever before. We'll be using more live messaging tools than ever before. But I think as this pandemic shambles on, I think we're seeing at least medium-term changes. When we get, for example, cars are really great social distancing tools. They automatically build up a 6-foot buffer in all directions, right? But we've been experiencing a decline in car usage for the past 10 years. It may be that we now experience an uptick in that, which is interesting. That can change behavior in some ways. I think digital resources, my bet is that as we use more of them, we'll keep using more of them. I'm not sure people are going to, I think the convenience will count for a lot, and people are going to be less likely to go back to some of their physical materials. A great question. It's a great question. Stephen B. asks if I could say more about the program. Oh, sure. And what I see about the future leadership of higher ed and how students will change. Okay, I teach in a program called Learning, Design, and Technology. It's a master's program where we teach people to basically become change agents for higher education. Often they graduate to become instructional designers. Some of them go on to continue their pre-program role and just do it in a more powerful way. And some of those are faculty, some of them are nonprofits, some of them are campus administrators. It's a great program. It's interdisciplinary, and the students are a really wide range of nations and ages and backgrounds. I just love it. The LDT program is a lot of fun. So one piece of that is we are doing a project right now called the Big Rethink. If you just go to my blog, you'll see a link to that, or you just Google Big Rethink in higher ed, you should probably find it. It's a live seminar happening right now. Classes meet tonight, in fact, on what 2020 is doing to higher education. One part of that is I've been interviewing, along with the students, about 20 fascinating people, college presidents, chancellors, faculty, technologists, some from around the world, Japan and Turkey, as well as in the US. And we're having just great conversations about what this is doing, how they see higher ed changing in their perspective. And all those are public, so you can just dive into all those. I think that's a great thing to do. And it's also a good example of leadership. I think leadership right now is in this interesting position where a lot of leaders are terrified. They want to get things done, and that's putting pressure on traditional forms of governance. So we're kind of entering into an ongoing state of emergency, and that can have real downsides when it comes to, say, consensus governance. Students and how they change. Right now, I got to defer a couple of months for you on that, Steve. I really want to see what enrollment looks like this fall. I do think we will see just the simple growth of online learning. Janelle, thank you so much for coming. Good luck with your new faculty orientation. Catherine Furlong, wait a minute, is that the Kate Furlong I know? If it is, let me know. She says, we need to focus on being kind to ourselves as we slouch towards the fall semester. Yeah, this is tricky. We need to do a lot of self-care, a lot of generosity, and it's damned hard because we have less money, which means we're working harder. So it's going to be very, very tough to do that. I think being kind to each other counts for a lot. And one of the things that I learned this spring was checking in with students to see how they were doing. That counted for a lot. That meant a lot to them. And I think doing that with colleagues and professionals is a really good thing to do. Let's see, we had, Boaz has a question. Do you see systems similar to Palantir taking over educational private sector partnerships to offer new services? I would definitely watch for a whole bunch of new services coming in. I mean, this is a time for a lot of startups, for a lot of entrepreneurships. And Kate, I'm so glad to see you. Hello, thank you for coming. You're going to see, as usual, companies from outside higher education kind of fumble around as they do this. You may see some startups from within higher education do this, and pre-existing players are desperately trying to put out ideas that can help things go. So look at LMS players, for example, look at publishers. And again, there's a lot of room for a lot of partnerships. Cindy, thank you for that very nice compliment. I really appreciate that. Friends, I'm afraid that we're running low on time, and I want to make sure that we get a few more questions of you. But also, I wanted to end on a positive note, an inspiring note. I want to second some of the nice positive comments that came from the chat, including from Kate Furlong's point about being kind to each other. Here are three things that just really inspire me and have inspired me every day since COVID-19 appeared. On the right is a screenshot from one of my students' projects. This is a student who just blows me away. So she was in my spring ed tech class, and she had a project she wanted to work on about Chinese language. Very cool project. But then we went home. Well, she was pregnant and ready to give birth. I said, fuck, just take it incomplete. We'll do this class later. She said, no, I will keep working. And she worked. I mentioned she was Chinese. She was from Wuhan. She was from Hubei province. She lost friends and family during the pandemic, and she kept working. She also had a job. She's an adult learner, part-time learner, and she kept working at that job, and she produced a great project. My point is, our students can be magnificent. And while it's still somehow fashionable to bash young people, I think they're freaking heroic, and we need to cling to them, and we need to celebrate them and support them. So the first point here is, I think students are helping make this future with us right now. They are students who are they're experiencing something that's going to change their lives forever. I mean, imagine being 18 right now. Imagine being 22. Right? We need their voices. We need their presence at our decision-making tables. As we rethink libraries, we need to have these students aboard helping us. We need their feedback. They're making this together with us. Second point is, this is a great time for collaboration. This is where collaboration is essential. Yeah, everyone wants to turtle in and put up the walls, but this is how we have to learn from each other. We have to learn from other institutions, from other professionals in different fields and in different sectors. We have to learn from museums, from private archives. We have to learn from public libraries. We have to learn from different kinds of universities. This is a great time for collaboration. As wonky and awful as social media can be, it's a great tool for doing all of this. We can keep doing it. And the third point is, one of the things that the Black Lives Matter mobilization has shown is that we are now in a moment of a focus on social justice and equity. And that's essential, and that's excellent. And we need to bring that focus to bear on everything we do as we try to revise all of these practices. Now, people like to end PowerPoint presentations with URLs and logos. So here are a few of mine. Top one links to a bunch of my projects. Second one to my Twitter feed. Third one to the logo of my company. Please click on any of these. I'd be glad to hear from you. Oh, I see. Our host has decloaked. She turned on her camera, which means I have to stop talking. Oh God, I've gone on too long. Oh no, I better stop now. Sorry. Thank you all. Thank you all for listening. Let me end the screen share here so you can all see our hostess, Jill.
Bryan, you were wonderful. Thank you so much for being here with us. I know we all enjoyed it thoroughly. So
Thank you for
what to
that.
say after that? It really was truly inspiring. And I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did, ending on such a great positive note as well. So please join me in thanking Bryan for being here with us. I took a lot of notes and have a lot of movie recommendations now that I intend to check out, and reading recommendations as well. We'll try to share all of these with you afterward. I do want to remind you quickly that there are many more presentations coming up on Wednesdays at noon for the next couple of weeks, and many on topics that Bryan mentioned, which is wonderful. So really excited. Please check out our Sched calendar if you haven't already. But I want to go ahead and just thank Bryan so much again for being here with us. And we hope to see you all again soon. Bryan, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Being with librarians is one of the best things in the world. And you guys asked so many good questions, had so many good comments. Thank you all for your patience, and thank you all for your work. Above all, please stay safe.
You too. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great week. See you next week. Take care. Bye. All right. Thank you so much, Bryan. We're going to go ahead